Um, how to approach this topic? So, I Christian Romanticism, the general idea of approaching the Christian faith with with the fullness of imagination, um, and with the fullness of the creative, poetic, and aesthetic sensibilities engaged, is I think a really big and important topic that seems to have um, become sidelined or undermined through history, um, in certain ways. So I was really excited that you've been running this course, on the theme of Christian Romanticism. Um, what like when it starts, we started talking about the Irish tradition and the poetic tradition, Christian tradition. Do you think that um the the Irish monks or the Celts sort of preserve something of the original Christian vision, um that yeah, do you think that?
Um, I don't know if I'd call it preserving the original Christian vision. Um, I mean, I think that's one of the things you see over the course of history. In fact, I just been going some bouts with a guy on Substack about this. Is that people tend to always think we're going to recapture what Jesus and the apostles had, which not I don't I think it's impossible, but I think that gets it wrong. I think what I think what the Irish were doing, and the thing is, the beautiful thing about it is we don't know enough about what the Irish were doing, so our own imaginations play into our interpretation of it, which is good. But to look, from what I can tell, they were far enough away from the halls of power and the reach of the Pope or whomever that they're kind of doing their own thing out there in the wilderness. And their Christianity kind of, um, well, it's two things. I think you have the tradition or you have what was handed down to them, but it also, because it's not as heavily monitored because of the wild places in which it is, it also has an organic relationship to the landscape,
Mm,
and it becomes uniquely of that place. And I think Christianity does that wherever it goes, but in the case of, or wherever it went, I should say, but in the case of Ireland, it was so far away that it
mhm,
had even more, I could call it, maybe you could call it freedom, but um, I could call it more freedom or less anxiety in order to to flourish in the way that was proper to it. And
mm,
and it's interesting if you look at Ireland, which didn't have any urban centers at the time, whereas Christianity was, on the continent and going into the Middle East was spread through metropolitan areas.
yeah,
And it's so
yeah,
it's so it's really weird that way that with the Celts, um, and parts of England as well. I would say most of England, especially or even Wales for in particular, Wales and Scotland, they all had a little bit of a wilder kind of Christianity.
mm.
And
Because
some people have tried to tie that to the Desert Fathers
mm,
and how though it is true that the Celtic Church did have a lot of very Eastern elements to it, and that Saint Patrick, from what I understand, received ordination in the south of France. So, which was also
interesting.
where Athanasius was, and Athanasius was a Greek Christian, not a Latin Christian. So it kind of filtered up that way. But I think it was not as formulated and solidified as it is now in those early days. And so
Mm,
there's a lot of that. But I still think, it's not Eastern Orthodoxy, the Irish version. It's a very unique manifestation of whatever that Celtic spirit was, and I got to think, right? It's also any place else Christianity went, whatever indigenous practices were there or traditions were there, melded with Christianity.
Mm.
You
Um,
could say they were baptized and becomes this unique thing.
yeah, because I mean, I suppose the general, like a general sort of interesting theme with this is the cities and immediate contact with nature that was emphasized in Ireland and must have been elsewhere in rural Europe, but there were, of course, these big metropolitan centers, and all I can say is like consulting my own experience. I've lived in London, I'm living in Bristol now, and I'm from sort of rural England in the southeast. And one can feel in the energy of a place, of course. The big thing I feel is like the pace with nature, just like, but birds and winds and just the pace of things is different. And and another one I've been thinking about is how the idea spirit can means or pneuma
Yeah.
or ruach means wind. And so if you've got all of these big buildings blocking the wind, or I don't know, like I don't know exactly what my thought is, but I think there's a way in which uh, that intensity and aliveness of the natural world, which is so very inspiring. Like it really is so inspiring to be in direct contact with that. Um, I don't know, it may have become lost in the scholastic halls of medieval Europe, or I'm not sure quite what happened, but it
Well,
seems
well, I think what
important.
happened, you see, is over time, Christianity, and even going back to the Middle Ages or even before, Christianity became more and more intellectualized, which I think, that's part of the Neoplatonic background. I think it was more intellectualized, and it is certainly. And the thing is, here's the thing, right? What we have handed down to us was from about 1% of the population, the Christian population, because they were
Yeah,
the only ones who were literate. It was the monks. So they're the ones recording things. And of course, they're recording things from their perspective. They're not, you never see them talking about what the peasants were doing in
yeah,
Aquinas, right?
yeah,
They're all
yeah,
talking
yeah,
to each
yeah.
other. And they're not even speaking they're not speaking to the people, to the peasantry. They're speaking to each other scholastics, with other academics, other theologians.
Hmm.
That's who they're in dialogue with.
So you think that may have been a kind of rift between the monastic centers, the elitist monastic centers, and the illiterate
I wouldn't say a
peasantry?
rift, but the thing is,
Yeah,
I think Aquinas was talking to other theologians.
yeah, sure.
It wasn't that he disdained the peasantry or the kind of parish life, but that's not who he was talking to, right? And I don't think it's until, and I'm sure there are examples out there that will prove me a liar, but it's not until Saint Francis of Assisi that you see at least recorded in writing, the concerns and values of the common people
Mm,
placed into language, and that's been recorded, that became canonical,
mm.
which is weird because I don't know if you know this. One of my favorite authors, a British man. Where's the book? Here's one of them. I got the whole shelf on where they all are. Do you know H.J. Massingham?
No.
I'm turning the British on to the British here, people. But he was described as an agrarian. And somehow where I bumped into a quote from him in a book by Christopher Bamford, the late great Christopher Bamford. And so I started tracking this guy's books down. And this one's called The Tree of Life
Hmm.
by H.J. Massingham.
Interesting.
And for him, and he was really pushing this idea of what we call the Celtic or the British Church. And and really committed to this idea that when the church became estranged from the land, from the cosmos, it was where the church started to go astray. And so he was even trying, this is back in the 1930s and 40s, trying to reconnect the land and Christianity.
Mhm.
Um, and he points to a lot of the people he points to the metaphysical poets as doing, as Henry Vaughan in particular is doing that. And he pointed to Saint Francis, and he points to the gospel, because who is Jesus talking to in the gospel? Not other academics. He's talking to peasants, which is
Mhm.
why he uses so many metaphors and parables, with farming or
Mhm.
vine
Mhm.
keeping. Here's a great example. So I live on a farm, and we raise animals as well as vegetables and bees. And so well, we've been doing this for a long time, but we ch kind of changed the livestock we raise according to how many of our children still live at home. And we had dairy goats for a long time, and then we're doing dairy cows for a few years. And uh then when my youngest daughter went away to college, my second youngest, who still lives with us, they both do, was working. It was just became too much for us to handle all the milking with the cows. So this year we switched to only sheep. And we've done sheep before, but we're just doing only sheep this year. And here's the thing. Um, so I'm the one who takes care of the sheep. So I go out every morning, make sure they have water and food, let them out. And my wife never goes out there with them. But so as last week, I think my wife was pulling some weeds from the garden, and usually you can throw some weeds from the garden over the fence and call them, and they'll come and eat it, right? Well, they won't call when she calls because they don't know who she is. And then if I walk out there and I call, they come right away. And she said, it's just like in the gospel. They know the voice of the shepherd, right?
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
that's what Jesus was speaking to. And what I had from that experience, this is exactly what Jesus was talking about, and who he was talking to. Who would have known that? They wouldn't have had to, it was not, I that's a nice metaphor. No, it's how it works, right?
Mhm.
It's a
Mhm.
metaphor when you apply that to Jesus, the good shepherd, right? And that's what I keep telling my wife. I'm the pretty good shepherd. I'm not the good shepherd. I'm pretty good. Um, but and so and of course, Massingham also ties that to handcraft. Jesus is born, he's born in a manger. He's a carpenter, right? And how all of those things, the connection to nature, the connection to handcrafts, are all the
Mhm.
things the West has been letting go of for generations now. And he was writing this almost 100 years ago.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
now
yeah.
more,
Well, yeah, I mean, the Industrial Revolution, I suppose, is like a big thing in this, which is why I think Blake is so pivotal as he was
yeah.
living through, he's witnessing the Satanic Mills, you know. Um, so Massingham's thesis is that these kind of rural, traditional sort of practices, woodcraft and animal husbandry, etc., would um, render the Gospels more immediately sort of intelligible or understandable.
And yes, he would. And the thing is because um, what's implied through all of his work is that, um, and this is what drew me to it because I already had this kind of sensibility, is that um, the church, however you want to understand that term, is a cosmic entity, and cosmic does not mean otherworldly. It means connected to the cosmos, which, as I know, and I grew up in the city, grew up in Detroit. This is the most city you can grow up in. Um, but I've been farming for 30 years, and to be attentive to the rhythms of nature and our relationship to the sun and the moon and the stars in providing food, and not and the breeding patterns of animals or whatever it happens to be. For instance, you might not know this, but turn my phone off. Um, so a couple days ago, somebody was buying some eggs from me, my hen's eggs, and explaining, do they lay a lot this time of year? I said, well, no, they don't. And And the reason they don't, well, there's a lot of different reasons, but one of the things that's interesting with both bees and hens in the northern hemisphere anyway, is um so this time of year they start to slow down their laying, both queen bees and hens. They slow down. They don't stop, but they slow down. And well, actually, they slowed down right after St. John's Day is when they really start to slow down, even right before. And by the time it gets to Christmas, you might get 4 eggs a week out of 20 hens, right? It's not, they
Right.
really slow down.
Okay.
But when it gets toward Candlemas, which is the 2nd of February, or the Feast of the Purification, or St. Bridget's Day, right, which is right there, um, they start to lay. And this is when the queen bee starts to lay eggs again, which
Mm.
is kind of talk about this beautiful harmony between the natural world or the natural year and the church year, right?
Yeah.
And and then by May Day, it's insane how many eggs both. Well, the bees will start swarming around then because it's too crowded in the hive, so they'll
Right.
break into
Yeah.
half, right?
Yeah.
And so but that it's also reflective in the church year, at least. I think the Anglican Church still preserves some of this. The Catholic Church only the traditional, observations of the Catholic Church do, and Orthodox to a degree, but I don't know if it works as well in the West. Um, they the liturgy over the course of the year reflected what was going on in the cosmos,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Even in England, right? They don't call it the fall term in college; it's Michaelmas term, right? Even though England's pretty much a secularized country, completely by now, right? But that's
I
how it's kind of
this
and Massingham is trying to remind us that you want a healthy civilization. This is how you do it. You connect
mm,
Christianity and the cosmic order with the rhythms of nature.
mm.
It's the big
Yeah,
thing.
it's interesting you like saying that about like secular Britain because it's like it's hard. I mean, Tom Holland as a historian has been sort of onto this recently, but like because of what you're saying there about the liturgy and its relationship to agricultural lifestyles that go on for generations and for the seasons and stuff like this. It feels like very Christianized in Britain. I mean, obviously in a certain sense, because we've had many, many centuries of it. And I suppose, yeah, of course, there have been secularization processes in modernity, but we still, yeah, I know, keep certain days holy. And like, yeah, I mean, Christmas, of course, and Easter and these different things. I mean, they're recognized to a greater or lesser degree, but I mean, I think you're completely right. And I mean, the big thing here is with the sun, obviously. Like the
Yeah.
sun, the sun is um when you start paying attention to the sun, you realize why people might have worshipped it once upon a time.
Well, yeah, well, especially in Lincoln, because it's, if you look on the globe, and we're in Michigan in the US,
Mhm.
and of course you're in England, but if you look at a globe, Michigan is on the same parallel as Spain.
Okay.
But
Yeah,
you
yeah.
wouldn't think about that, would you? Because Michigan gets very cold,
That
right?
surprised me. Yeah, yeah.
And
Okay.
England is so much farther north, which, a friend of mine lives there, and I was telling her, and she was American, and she moved there. I said, "What was the hardest thing to get used to?" She said, "The sun." I said, "Why?" It comes up at 3 in the morning during the summer. It took her a while to get used to that.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, but I mean, it's power rising is spring, isn't it? Like that's
Yeah.
like life more abundant when it rises, and when it's gone midsummer and it turns the other way. Like, I mean, that is very simple stuff, but like that is quite a big deal. Um, but yeah, I mean, there's things like supermarkets and the way we approach food now that disconnect
Yeah,
a lot of people, I think, from these very basic, what do I say, humble, like of the earth
yeah. Well,
practices,
and
really.
people,
Yeah.
yeah, and people are so, I don't know how it is there, but in general in these states, people are so disconnected to where their food comes from.
Hmm.
So disconnected to where it comes from. And I think that's also, I mean, it's, it's plus the way it's processed, it's another thing. But it's really that being disconnected from that disconnects one from the cosmos. And to be disconnected from the cosmos, as far as I'm concerned, is to be disconnected from God in a way.
Hmm. No, I mean, I completely agree.
I mean, there's a reason Easter is celebrated on the first Sunday after the first full moon after the spring equinox.
Oh yeah, the first full moon. Yeah.
You know,
Yeah. No, I actually asked at Easter this year, and my aunt asked me if I knew why Christmas was, no, why Easter fell on that day, and yeah, we didn't know that, but yeah, the full
that's
moon.
why.
It
That's how the date of Easter
that
set. Yeah,
yeah.
it don't get no more cosmic than that.
Yeah. Um. So the metaphysical poets, like so Traherne, Vaughan, there's the brothers Vaughan, aren't there? Thomas and is it Thomas and Henry?
Henry, Thomas and Henry. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, they are an interesting lot. Really interesting. Traherne is probably my favorite poet in
Yeah.
English, personally. Um, and Herbert, George Herbert. That
Yeah.
I'd love to sort of discuss a little bit about what you think their sort of
Oh yeah, I can.
essential insight is.
I, I wrote my dissertation on a few of those guys, so
Okay, okay,
I
yeah,
can.
yeah.
Yeah, I probably know a lot of arcane stuff. Nobody cares to hear about. Um, well, I think if you look at the metaphysicals, starting with Donne. Well, actually, you can go a little before Donne. You can start with oh, what's his name? Drawing a blank. Hold on. I got it. Two people. Okay. The two figures that uh predate the official metaphysicals with Donne are Robert Southwell. Do you know
Okay,
him? He was the Jesuit poet.
okay. I'm not sure.
He wrote some pretty incredible verse, which spread around in England in manuscript. And he kind of made religious poetry cool again, even though he
Mm,
was later executed by the crown for treason because he questioned whether if if the if the queen could still be styled sacred after when she was going after the Jesuits.
okay, yeah.
And the other person is Sir Philip Sidney,
Hmm.
who was actually related to Herbert by marriage. And
Ah,
Sidney,
interesting.
who died young, I think at 32, he had started work on what's now called the Sidney Psalter. And the idea with the Sidney Psalter is he was going to do verse loose translations of the Psalms with the only stipulation was that you not one form of verse could be repeated as you went through all 143 Psalms. And he died after about 50 or 60, I can't remember exactly how many he died, and then his sister took over and finished the job for him. And it's a beautiful, I mean, it's an amazingly impressive collection of poetry because part of Sidney's project and his era, because Sidney was a contemporary of Shakespeare, was to really forge an English literature that was not based on Italian forms or French forms, right?
Yeah,
That
yeah.
was a big deal for these guys. And so the Sidney Psalter was enormously influential in religious poetry and poetry in general, but especially religious poetry, and the idea of making it new and not repeating yourself. And you see that with John Donne.
Mm-hmm.
who I always think of John Donne as he's just pyrotechnics. He's just the way the way he throws metaphors at each other like a super collider, things you would never expect to go together, and he comes up with these astounding this astounding poetry, like in a Good Friday heading westward. It's a really phenomenal poem where his back is turned to where Christ is being crucified, right? And he calls seeing I think it's a beautiful phrase that calls the crucifixion itself the spectacle of too much weight, which is
Mm.
beautiful.
Mm.
But and then so you have those guys, and then when done, especially in his religious poetry, is maintains this kind of pyrotechnics, shock and awe approach to writing poetry, like batter my heart, three-person God, right? And I am never chaste unless you ravish me. I mean, he just pulls out break, blow, burn to make me new. And then he was friends with George Herbert's mother. George Herbert is like a generation younger than Donne. Also took holy orders. And you could see in Don in Herbert the in his book The Temple in particular, which is if you got to read The Temple, you got to read it from beginning to end because that's how it was meant to be read. It's called The Temple because we are the temple of the Holy Spirit, but it's also
Mm.
called The Temple because it's about the church, and it's also called The Temple because it's the reading of that book from beginning to end is like a movement through a church building because it begins with the poem The Altar, because the first thing you see when you walk into a church is the altar, even though it's not the first thing in the room. That's the whole architecture goes right to the altar, right? And then that book kind of moves through, and he's I always think of Herbert as like the Cracker Jacks. Do you get Cracker Jacks in Britain?
I don't think so.
Cracker
Crackers,
Jacks.
yeah.
I don't even know if they still have them in the States. It used to be like this box of popcorn, carameled popcorn with peanuts in it, but it always had a
Nice.
prize in the box.
Yeah. Yeah.
And he's like that. He's every one of his poems. There's some kind of surprise in there, but you have to find it, right? So he's
Nice.
always
Yeah. Yeah.
and he does. And then, but that book, The Temple, also starts off in the church, but it ends in heaven. So it's like the earthly pilgrimage as well as the architecture of the church. And there's one of the poems called Church Windows, and the church windows is a metaphor for the priest because the word of God shines through the priest, like in a church window, right? And,
Mm.
and he's got the wonderful, clever pun with that. I can't remember how the speaker more reverend grows, becomes more of a reverend, you know. So it's kind of stunning. It's really an achievement. The Temple is really one of the most remarkable achievements of that era in poetry because it's
Okay.
so
I've not read that.
architectural.
That sounds like an amazing work of art. Yeah, I've read some of Herbert's sort of devotional lyrics, like Love and
Oh, Love
different
3, yeah.
ones. Yeah. Um, and so what you're saying about Sydney there, so these poets are helping us to see things afresh, is what you seem to emphasize there, like with
They're trying
new
to
eyes or
surprise
something.
us into finding God. Certainly for
Hmm.
Herbert and Dunn, whether it's through the imagery or just the daring use of language. They're trying to. Well, actually, in one of my books, which book is it? It's Incarnation of the Poetic Word. I have a chapter on Herbert there, and the title of that chapter is The Phenomenology of Grace. Because I think what Herbert's trying to do through his poetry is show us how grace works,
Hmm.
right? And that's what his surprises are all about, right? He wants to surprise us. Like me see. Do I have it here? Let me grab something real quick. All right. If I can find it. Up here someplace. There it is. So let me find. There we go. There's the church. So he's got this poem, The Collar. If you know that one, hold on. I think I'm going to look it up. There you go. Let me see. All right, 153. Okay. So I'll just read the beginning of this. So here it is, The Collar. I struck the board and cried, "No more, I will abroad. What, shall I ever sigh and pine? My lines in life are free, free as the road, loose as the wind, as large as store. Shall I be still in suit? Have I no harvest but a thorn to let me bleed and not restore? What have I lost with cordial fruit? Sure there was wine before my sighs did dry it. There was corn before my tears did drown it. Notice what he does there. There were sighs before there was wine before my sighs did dry it. There was corn before my tears did drown it. He perverts the Eucharist. Well, he's saying that he perverted the Eucharist, right? So because corn or the wine is being dried and the corn is being wet. So he's reversing their characters, right? And part of what this poem's about is the title itself is a pun because it's about the collar. That's collar, right? The collar that a priest wears. But it's also collar, like being choleric, and it's also a collar because the way it would print, of course, you would pronounce it more closer to collar, right? Than I would in American English. So he's got all those three kinds of things. And so he's disputing with God, and he's actually not even following formal rules of verse. But when he gets to the end of he's basically bitching to God. Why do I have to be a priest? I'm a horrible person to be a priest, right? What are you doing to me? Suffering. And this is a guy whose health was never good. He was always suffering. And then he goes through all this complaining. And then he says, but as I raved and grew more fierce and wild at every word, methoughts I heard one calling child. And I replied, my Lord. So he switches. He just drops that bomb at the end there. Where you thought this poem was going is not where it goes. And the caller in this case is God. So there's the collar on Herbert the priest. There's the collar of his disposition in writing this poem. And then there's one, because what do you call the vocation is but your calling, right? So it's about his priesthood. So he's just an amazing poet.
That's really beautiful. This phenomenology of grace is what really strikes me about Traherne too, because it is like what I see with Traherne is like I'm being given new eyes, or my old eyes are being restored in some way. So this theme of the child as dwelling in an order of abundant grace in God's love, like uninhibited, fresh, alive, truly alive, and his wondering at his eyes and his hands and the entire structure of his senses and all of the vistas that they open to him. So do you see something similar there with Traherne? Like, because it seems something about religious experience, something very, very powerful and important, I think, is coming through about that phenomenology of grace. What does something like grace mean if we've got all of this dogmatics around it, if we've got all of
Well,
this Aquinas, as you say,
yeah.
then it could be an alienating thing to mean, oh, how do we understand grace? But then these poets in such beauty and simplicity
Well, and
can
they what they like when you take a the creative writing course, you know, the one thing they always tell you, show, don't tell, right? So
Okay,
theologians
yeah.
tell, and poets show how it works, and that's what I think. And I think you know it's easy to not to underestimate what profound influence Herbert was on poets like Traherne, or like Herbert was on Traherne. Is also he was an influence on Vaughan, even though I would never not call and also another one, Richard Crashaw. Um, the three of them read the Temple, and it was shattering to them because it showed them it was like the when the Beatles showed up, right? You mean you can do this with music? Okay. But he gave him license. And I think that his attention on grace is, but you especially see this in Traherne, right? Which is and now it manifests differently according to Traherne's personality, like as you mentioned, with all the attention on the child, right? How like an angel came I down, how bright are all things here, when first among his works I did appear, right? From his poem Wonder. And I'm glad you point out the stuff about the eye. In fact, there's a chapter in my book, Sophia in Exile, is called The Eyes of Thomas Traherne, because that was one of my big one of my big surprises. And that's what they do. They throw these, Easter eggs in there that surprise us. So when we figure out what they're doing, oh, that's it. And so he puns on I, meaning the eye, because an important part for Traherne is how we see things, right? We have to learn how to see the right way. Have to see things as a child or see things as God sees them. But also there's the I as in myself, right? Which is also, and this is a pun he takes right from Herbert's Love 3, who made the eyes but I, right? And then of course God only didn't he make the eyes, he made all the people who have a self, right? Right? And Traherne picked up on that, and he extended that to I as an affirmation, as in yes, right? Because if you read Traherne, I mean, we, he mentions sin, but he doesn't dwell on how sinful he is or anybody is. Yeah, there was sin. Yeah, okay, it was bad. Whatever. He just moves on, and because the point is not to, it's kind of an Augustinian notion, right? Love God and do what you will.
Yeah,
And if
because yeah, I mean, it's Traherne. It's also this is making me think of broader mystical currents like Burma and even Meister Eckhart and all of
yeah,
these, because in a way, sin is like, from my understanding, and I'd love to hear what you think of this, is that it's talking about the eye. Sin is a fallen perception, and this is strong in Blake too, with like Urizen and Ulro
yep.
and their manners of imagination, their manners which the eye sees, corrupted manners, fallen
Mhm.
imaginations, that see in terms of strife, separation, and well, non-grace in some manner.
Yeah,
That's some kind of expulsion from the
right.
garden, dare I say
And,
it.
and that's what will Blake. There's a refrain that comes over and over again in his epic, illuminated book, Jerusalem, the emanation of the giant Albion, where he keeps saying, "And they became what they beheld." And because the thing you attend to is what you will become, right? So, and that's a lesson we get from Traherne as well. I mean, if you attend to the kingdom, you attend to becoming unless you're a child, you'll never enter the kingdom of heaven. unless you can do that, you'll become whatever you're looking at. And Traherne blames the crappy educations they were getting back in the 17th century, right? Which took you away from that perception. That and that's one thing that when people have often asked me, because I used to be a Waldorf teacher and a professor for a long time, um, if I would write something about education for children. And I keep thinking maybe I'll do this one day, but it's a huge project. But the one thing I would emphasize is um, the kind of purification of the senses that allows a child to enter into the world in a way that's reverent. That you enter, to do like Traherne does, like how like an angel came I down, and that you can, um, you reveal the wonder, and this is what happens, right? We reveal the wonders to children and participate in their wonder, especially when they're little. Before, even so, when I was a Waldorf teacher, a kid would come up with a piece of cinder. Mr. Martin, look what I found. I said, oh, that's really beautiful, right? What do you think it is? You know, and because they don't want the answer to it. They want you to help you to participate in their dreaming into it, their wonder, right? Oh, that's just because some people like bring a broken bird's egg to a parent or a teacher. Look what I found. Open it down. It's dirty. But if you say, well, it's beautiful, a baby bird came out of that. It was full of life not too long ago. Isn't it beautiful? You're doing such a service to a child that way. And our Western civilization right now starts in cynicism or negativity, and especially in our relationship to the natural world. So why do you think people are alienated from their own bodies? We're alienated from the cosmos.
I completely agree. I mean, it's a really complex story to tell, isn't it? Because there's the Industrial Revolution, there's Freud, Marx, Darwin, might have missed one, but like the whole
I wish
19th
I could have written about
century.
those guys.
Yeah, I mean, there's been this whole attack. I mean, well, Freud is rediscovering Eros, really, like
Yeah,
is what he's doing. He has his whole theories about it, but like he's the generation of Christian sexual repression, of Victorian sexual repression, and that kind of thing is kind of where psychoanalysis is born, and the
yeah,
whole study of dreams and the unconscious and all of this is like, I don't know, that's kind of an important perception.
yeah.
Um, I wondered what you thought of the relationship between the esoteric and sort of mystical currents, so alchemy and astrology, in this kind of imaginative outlook that we're talking about. Because, like the I mean, I have a sense, maybe following C.S. Lewis, that like the medieval world may have been open to, yeah, this cosmic sense, like you're saying, in a way
Mhm.
that modern people aren't. And um, I
Yeah.
know that like one of the Trahernes I'd heard, I think it's Henry, one of them
Vaughns, you mean?
is the Vaughan. Sorry, yeah, I do mean that. Was an alchemist in the 17th century when this was all happening,
Right.
and the alchemical. I won't go on to a whole other thing about that, but that's there's a big source for Carl Jung in
Yeah.
his sense of this imaginative,
Right.
cosmic,
Mhm.
the recovery of that kind of vision. Yeah, so I was wondering, yeah, if you had thoughts on
Well,
how
yeah, I
that
can tell.
related to what we're saying.
So in my dissertation, I have a chapter on Henry and Thomas Vaughan called "The Rosicrucian Mysticism of Henry and Thomas Vaughan."
Okay, interesting. Yeah.
And and I also did a chapter on Jane Lead or Jane Led of the Philadelphian Society, and I also did one on John Dee, the
John Dee, of course. Yeah.
magician.
Yeah.
And there was one on John Donne as well, and Kenelm Digby, who's an alchemist. and a Catholic apologist. And when I did my defense, my dissertation, one of my examiners said, Michael, do why did you take on so many weird people in your dissertation? And I told her they're only weird to us. At the time, they would have considered themselves traditionalists. They were not weird. They didn't they were maintaining kind of a medieval or late Renaissance view of how the cosmos was. So
Hmm.
they would have bristled at calling them weird.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
What's weird, you know? And Henry and Thomas Vaughan is a great example of that because not only was Thomas Vaughan an alchemist, but he was also an Anglican priest.
Mm. Yeah,
And
yeah, 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 yeah.
Henry, I don't know if you could technically call him an alchemist, but he was a Paracelsian physician, which
Okay,
is
yeah,
pretty darn
yeah,
close to being an alchemist. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Um, but they were maintained and actually one of their contemporaries, a little bit older than them, Robert Flood, if you know about him.
Blood, of course, yeah, yeah.
Well, they were all they what and I always think about this. I said, what would happen if all the brain power and finance and everything else went into maintaining their approach to science rather than going into materialistic science?
This is great because this gets us exactly to Milbank's alternative
And
modernities,
yeah,
right?
that's what I was
Yeah,
about to
yeah, yeah,
say.
yeah. Yeah,
And
yeah.
that's what when Milbank read, my publisher sent my book, The Submerged Reality, to him to write a jacket endorsement. And Milbank got excited about it, and he even had his friend Adrian Paps write an introduction for the book because they saw, oh, here's an American who sees what we're doing over here in radical orthodoxy. He's tracing out the alternative modernity, which is
Hmm.
basically what I've been doing. Um, and uh, and I'm glad, you see that in Milbank, you see it also in David Bentley Hart,
Hmm. Yeah.
um, some other, strongly in both of those guys who are also um try let's make theology weird again. You know what I mean?
Well,
they're well,
it's
they
trying
look at the
to.
Hermetic traditions and they go, wait, these guys weren't crazy.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, Flood. Yeah, like he had discourses with Kepler. Like he had a
Yeah.
famous correspondence with Kepler. Like it's
And he was a
and
member
yeah,
of the Royal
no,
Society. Yeah.
yeah, of course, and Newton, of course. So yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, and Boyle, and yeah, it all comes out of
Yeah.
very esoteric currents for sure. I mean, so that project, as I understand it, would be Milbank, Bentley Hart, or someone wanting to embrace an alternative modernity would be wanting to affirm the natural sciences, affirm modernity in some sense, not to reject it wholesale
Right.
and say that the study of nature is important, but to do so on a metaphysical foundation or an imaginative vision that is not reductive and materialistic.
Right.
Uh, is that a fair summary of your sort of understanding? Because it seems to tie in the idea of an alternative modernity seems to tie in the theological mystical currents with an approach to science as well,
Right.
perhaps within that.
Well, well, I think you see it over the course of time. I don't, the um a friend of mine, Spencer Clavin, I don't know if you know who he is. He just wrote a book. It's about to come out on science in this kind of way. And he asked me to look at it, an early draft of it. And one of the things I told him, I said, it's pretty good, but don't act like there was nothing, all of a sudden went completely materialistic in the 17th century. The guys who were doing, imaginative science didn't go away. They just didn't have the limelight. And if you go,
Hmm.
so we mentioned Flood and those people, and that was at the kind of transition point where
Hmm.
Flood and Boyle and the Vaughns, but it never went away. And you see it especially come back in the 18th and 19th century with Goethe's scientific work, right? He's practicing a kind of alternative science that is, in one way, it has you can trace its DNA to Paracelsus and the medieval natural philosophers. But on the other hand, it's very modern, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's very
Mm-hmm.
much, and you see this throughout time. You see it even with going into the earlier or the mid 20th century with David Bohm. The
David Bohm, of course. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, yeah. I'm
with
glad you said
David
that.
Bohm
Yeah.
and one
Well, and the physicists. A lot of the physicists, let's be honest, in the 1930s are really strange fellows.
yeah. Well, even
Like
Heisenberg, right? Heisenberg said,
Heisenberg. Yeah, who do you have? Pauli is the guy who had
yeah,
therapy with Jung and were discussing. Jung was saying about the self, he was saying about the atom, and they were like,
yeah.
could these be sides of the same thing? And
Yeah, and I think quantum mechanics and really kind of
yeah.
affirms that. And they had to do the materialistic detour, before they came back to this. And David Bohm is kind of amazing with his idea of implicate order. Is
Yeah.
That's really, I would not say repackaging. It's a rediscovery of the same sensibility that Flood had, that the part is implied in, and this is you get this from Burma, that the part
Hmm.
is implied in the whole and the whole is implied in the part, right?
Hmm.
So not just the cosmos, and it goes back to the idea of the microcosm and the macrocosm, right? And that's what David Bohm is doing, right? When he's talking about implicate order.
I think
And
yeah,
we're
you're absolutely right. Yeah,
and
I
that's about
think
as
that
medieval a viewpoint as you can come to.
yeah. Do you think the winds are changing with it? Because I mean, I need to perhaps wrap up in five or something. But so Bohm. Yeah, I mean, there was a documentary on Bohm. I think it was called Infinite Potential or something.
Yes,
It's
I
quite
think I saw that. Yeah.
yeah, it came out relatively recently. I think what do you think about like the state of modern science? Because I think like there's a Bohm. Well, the fact that the documentary came out is indicating he's being taken more seriously. He was obviously a brilliant, absolutely brilliant mind. I can
And
wholeheartedly
a and
agree.
a and a good man too. That's the other part, right?
Mm,
I mean, so he's a
mm,
really moral, good person.
yeah, I
I
mean,
think
yeah,
you see him. I think, in the weird thing is, I think right now is probably the darkest time for science and medicine ever, because it's been so captured by demonic forces, and I mean that seriously, in government and corporations or whatever, right? But there are still this alternative science that's out there. And another person, oh, what's his name? I wrote him an email once inviting him to a conference. He blew me off. But it was I can't remember his name. Another physicist. But there's also Rupert Sheldrake, who is much
Sheldrake,
maligned,
yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah, yeah,
But but he's no slouch, right? I mean, he paid his dues,
yeah,
but
yeah, yeah, yeah.
they try to paint him into a corner and let him paint him as a kook, and he's not.
Well, this just gets to all like the whole thing with was it Thomas Kuhn was the structure of scientific revolutions, the whole
Yeah,
notion that paradigm shift in science and that's the
right,
nature of science is anti dogma. Like so,
right,
but yet
exactly.
these dogmas of course do endure. And even to call Bohm alternative figure is I guess true from the perspective of the mainstream purveyors of scientism, I suppose. But
Mhm.
like he's a major physicist of the 20th
Yeah,
century. He made very, very important contributions. And
absolutely. And
so yeah.
so I think, maybe the short haul, it's science is doomed, but long haul, I think, well, it can't. Put it this way, it can't remain imprisoned. It just can't.
Yeah.
It just can't, because the human spirit cannot remain imprisoned. And
Yeah.
I think, and this is when I go back to thinking what would happen, and we may get to that point where we find out what would have happened had all the brain power and money gone into this alternative mode of doing science, than rather than the materialistic version.
Yeah.
You
I
know what I
mean, I
mean?
think there are, I don't know. It seems to me that theoretically a lot of people are taking the view that materialism is philosophically bankrupt, is
Oh
not
yeah.
a good position to hold in the cultural moment, and are searching for alternative metaphysical pictures upon which to base their science and stuff like that. But I mean, yeah, we're talking about big shifts and stuff, but I
But
don't
there's,
know. I'd say
I should
reasons
mention
to
this. I'm
hope
going to
for
mention one other
changing.
scientist.
Hmm.
So this was a mind-blowing experience. So my publisher asked me to review this book, and then he later asked me to edit it, copy edit it, by Martin Nowak, who is a mathematical biologist. I think it's his position at Harvard. And this book blew me away. It's poetry, but it's imaginative and it's mystical and cosmic, and I was blown away. And I interviewed him on my podcast about a month ago or so, and he said it was the first time he had ever written anything that was poetic. But his position as an evolutionary mathematical biologist is that numbers reveal God, and that though Darwin had something, he was right to a degree about competition. The real thing with evolution is cooperation. And Martin is a very devoted Catholic, grew up in Austria, and it was a blessing to talk to this guy. And so I told him he gives me hope for science because he knows the drill. He knows what's going on the sciences, right? And it was refreshing to talk to him in that way. So there are people out there, right?
Yeah, for sure. Look, thanks so much for taking the time. I mean, this whole thing of alternative modernities, I'd love to discuss, yeah, further at another point, because yeah, it's something that very much interests me, because because you're absolutely right. It was this prevailing. It was universal, really,
It
in
was
that in the
pretty
17th
soon. It was a
century. It
cultural
was,
assumption. Yeah,
yeah, yeah, and so yeah, it would be amazing to see that renewed.
yeah.
Anyway, look, thanks so much
Hey,
for taking the time.
my pleasure. Thank you.